Buonasera a tutti, benvenuti.
Welcome everyone to this fifth session here in the auditorium. The meeting is approaching its conclusion, but tonight we are going to deal with a very difficult theme. As you might see from the title, it concerns our everyday life. Terrorism is a part of the urban scenario. Recent events, as those of Barcelona, are just a part of a long series of terrible attacks that have overturned the life of common people. It is called an asymmetric war. And I would like to draw your attention on the words of this title. Nihilism is an ancient Western world dating back to the 19th century, but it doesn't concern only a philosophical or political phenomenon, but rather the fact that each and every one of us could give up to emptiness, to use our freedom to become, in a way, sterile, or, as the mother of a terrorist said in England, to become petrified. Augustinus used to talk about the fascination of emptiness. In one of the most successful exhibitions here at the meeting, we can see that 1 century ago, the Russian society, the Russian people, the Russian church fell in the hands of one of the bloodiest dictatorship of history. A minority, even though they said they were the majority, took power over society because society had become empty, because it had given in to fear and emptiness. These young terrorists, biesmativni terroristi, that is to say, terrorists without a reason, 20 years old people who committed 23,000 attacks in 20 years, 11,000 victims. So, well, with all the differences that we have to take into account, this fascination of emptiness that lead us, or some of us, to say, "Oh, I love death more." Well, this fascination is extremely real. And then the other word of the title is jihadism, which means in a way a deformation of a principle which is present in the Quran that has been transformed into something terrible, into some kind of monster. And here is the link with the second part of the title. Religious instrumentalization poses a serious question to the West. Up to a few years ago, well, now there are the symptoms of a change, but great thinkers, great politicians, as for instance John Rawls, stated that the secularized state, liberal state was an empty space without the religious phenomenon that becomes only a private thing. So there is this void, but this emptiness in the end enters into the heart of man. So it is not enough to have slogans like violence is created by religions. This is something that many still think today with reference to Islam. So we need to understand better. We need to go beyond these slogans. We need to go beyond political instrumentalizations in order to really face something that actually concerns every single one of us. So today, in this session, we will have different themes. Radicalism that uses for its own purposes the religious dimension, then the role of religion in the public space. As Cardinal Tron said a few years ago, we needed to understand whether religion is part of the problem, as many seem to think, or rather, it is part of a solution for a new civilization, and as it actually is the case. I would like to read a few lines from the Evangelii Gaudium by Pope Francis, where the question of religious freedom is described as follows: a healthy pluralism that respects the others and values as such does not imply a privatization of religions with the pretense to make them silent and to just close them into the minds of people or within the walls of synagogues and mosques. This would represent, in effect, a new form of discrimination and authoritarianism. The respect due to the minorities, to the agnostic, to non-believing minorities should not be imposed arbitrarily in a way that silences the convictions of the believers or ignores the wealth of religious traditions. In the long run, this would feed resentment rather than tolerance and peace. So before introducing our two speakers, I would like to mention Jan Figel, Special Envoy of the European Commission for the Promotion of Religious Freedom outside the EU, who was invited to participate, should have been here today. He apologizes for not coming. He is not here because of personal health problems, actually. As I said, he apologizes and he asks us to support him in this difficult moment. So to tackle such a complex theme that entails a lot of prejudice, well, we are lucky enough to have here, for the first time at the meeting, one of the most famous experts in Islam, Professor Olivier. who is a co-president of the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies and of the Social and Political Science Department of the European University. So he's not just like a scholar, so to speak, but is actually someone who has a great knowledge. He has led the OECD mission for Tajikistan in 1993-94. He was consultant for the coordinator of Afghanistan for the United Nations, and he was director of the project Religious West. It deals with the Middle East, with the political Islam in the West, and comparative religions. He has published many studies and books, the latest being, many were translated into Italian. The Holy Ignorance, published in Italy by Feltrinelli, and The Royaume Perdu of 2014, and the most recent one, ISIS Generation. You can buy it here at the meeting at the bookstore. The young people who decided to choose the ISIS and why do they fight the West. Here, on my left, there is a friend of the meeting. This is his third time here at the meeting, Brian Grimm. Welcome. He is the president of the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation. He is member of the Council of the Economic Forum. He is a consultant in terms of geopolitical matters for the Tony Blair Faith Foundation. He is one of the main experts of the social and economic impact of religious freedom. He is visiting a professor at the St. Mary University of London. Among his publications, The Price of Freedom Denied. He has worked in Europe, in Asia, and in the Middle East. So, and I invite Brian Grimm to talk about some of the existing positive perspectives that show the contribution based on a real religious freedom, the positive contribution of religions for our civil coexistence. You have the floor.
Thank you, Don Pino. Sorry, I will speak in English, but I thank the interpreter for the help. So today I'm going to ask you two questions. First, have you ever wondered why God chose a businessman to be the husband of the Virgin Mary and the stepfather of Jesus? He chose a carpenter who had a carpentry business. I guess it's the first time you've been asked that question. Well, think about it with me. So, in our world, God created us both spiritual and physical. We have spiritual needs, we have human needs. And to take care of this young family, God chose a man who had some strength, who had some possibilities, because the challenges of the world were great, including Herod's persecution, and they had to flee to Egypt. He had to use his worldly strength and knowledge to protect the Savior and Our Lady. So you could say that the worldly Joseph was just as spiritually important as the Blessed Virgin in that family. Much of my work is to help make known these connections between what we do every day and the impact we can have in the world. And whatever your profession, whatever work you do, it's just as sacred as what the priest does. These are vocations we have from God. Let me give an example of the power of just one businessman in advancing religious freedom by working with people from different religions. The country is Indonesia. Indonesia has the largest Muslim population of any country, but it also has a large Christian population, Hindu, Buddhist, and other faiths. Now, Indonesia has a particular problem that puts 40 million children into poverty. The problem is these children do not have a birth certificate and therefore cannot go to government schools, get health care, get good jobs, go on for education. And the reason they don't have birth certificates was discovered by this businessman. His employees, he noticed, were having a hard time providing for their families, coming to work, helping their sick children. And he asked, what's the problem? And they said, well, we don't have birth certificates because we never got married. Why? And he said, well, why aren't you married? And they said, because we have to have a religious wedding and a secular wedding. The religious wedding requires a large dowry, and that's too expensive. And the government wedding requires so much red tape. So the result is 40 million children today have no birth certificate. Now, he said, well, I think I can solve that. So he brought together Muslims, Christians, Hindus, and organized a mass wedding so that the Hindus and the Muslim priests and the Catholic priest could give everyone a wedding at the same time, and then he had the government give the certificates. Well, he did that for 5,000 couples, and then he did it again and again, and now the government has asked him, and he's a Catholic, he's asked the Muslim dominated government asked the Catholic to help solve this problem for all of Indonesia. So as he approached his work, he didn't think just of only making money, which he had to do, but he looked at the people. And in his position, he was able to take care. So one thing in the work I do is recognize these kind of business people who are advancing good peace and interfaith understanding. Let me show you a short video of this work.
That is more interconnected than any time in history, religious and intercultural tensions abound. Religious hostilities are sweeping the globe, disrupting societies and economies. However, there are those who are willing to step up and act as agents of change. During the 2016 Rio Paralympics, global business leaders were honored for their innovative work in addressing this problem. From Israeli tour businesses to Chinese media companies to large Indonesian conglomerates, business leaders all over the world are doing their part to make the world a safer, stronger, and more open place. Come meet these businessmen and women and new awardees who are overcoming religious intolerance and discrimination at the 2018 Global Business and Interfaith Peace Symposium and Awards in Seoul, Korea on March 7th and 8th, held during the 2018 Pyeongchang Paralympics. For more information or to nominate a business leader, visit religiousfreedominbusiness.org/awards 2018.
Now, I promised you a second question. Have you ever wanted to put to practice the parable of the Good Samaritan? So I think you all know the parable. Now, one thing you might not have thought of is the Good Samaritan was a foreigner with a foreign religion. And he is the one that Jesus tells us to look to as an example of loving our neighbor. Over the past year in Manchester, England, we've gotten together a group of Catholics, Muslims, and Mormons to take a course on leadership in order to put to practice the story of the Good Samaritan. The course is 10 weeks long, and they study topics like how to handle my finances, how to choose a good job, how to serve others, how to identify your core values, and all of this from a spiritual perspective. Now, this relates to the topic of radicalization in that one of the core reasons for radicalization is that people look at society, some Muslims look at Western society, and they consider it to be godless and hopeless. So by bringing young people together, including Muslims and Christians, together to look at these topics and then work together to help others in society do interfaith action, this is removing the space where radicalism can grow. So I'd like to show you now a second video that describes this course, and you can hear the reaction of some of the participants. And for many of them, it has changed their life.
Where some try to drive wedges between us by focusing on our differences. But regardless of race, religion, or culture, people are more alike than different. Empowerment Plus is an initiative that improves understanding and cooperation among nations and peoples across cultures and faiths, and reduces polarization. It does this by helping college and university students take leadership in their own lives and reach out beyond themselves. Empowerment Plus includes facilitated classroom experiences, state-of-the-art online learning, and interfaith action projects. Launching Leaders is the first experience in Empowerment Plus. Here's what some recent graduates and mentors have to say.
I think what Launching Leaders is doing is essentially building bridges between different groups and different people. And the hope is that all these people that have been enrolled in this program will help go out into their communities and show that leadership to other people.
I was surprised by how similar we are.
It has changed my perspective of just being open to all faith groups and not just having my own perspective, my own way of looking at people.
We all had the same struggles. We all found that we had weaknesses, and they were the same, and the way that we overcame them was also the same.
Yes, everyone has a different religion, but at the same time, we can all apply the same things and get to the same results.
And when you're working with people you might never talk to, it shows how much you have in common, and those common threads can be shared and empower you to go out into the real world and have practical skills, which I think are hugely important for us all.
And we all need to be proactive in saying that diversity, multiculturalism, faiths working together is actually crucial for the future of our world. So this course is one part, has got to be one brick in a bigger bridge really, so that we are building bridges, not walls, between one another.
I will definitely recommend the course because after these 10 weeks, I think I am different, and I would like other people to experience the same thing.
You can be part of the solution to problems that divide us today by starting or joining an Empowerment Plus program at a university, congregation, or community organization in your area. Contact us at religiousfreedomandbusiness.org/empowerment-plus.
So I said I'd ask you 2 questions, but I really have 3. The third question is, what can you do? Thank you.
Abbiamo visto
We have seen some examples, significant examples, of a positive function. You see that education is really the main issue here, getting back to reality, emphasizing the sense of responsibility and giving importance to one's sense of life. So why many young people go for death instead? Why? Is the germ of death inside religion, or is there something else? But the question is also open to religions. Does a so-called pure religion exist? A religion closed in itself that doesn't really take on the risk of finding concrete implementations in one's life. What is the origin of radicalism, which is not only a phenomenon in Islam? Why does a person become fundamentalist? Why do we exploit religions? And how is it possible to respond to these dynamics, whose consequences, as we all know, are devastating? Now, Professor Ra, you have the floor. Religious fundamentalism is not a new phenomenon. In fact, attacks in the name of a religion are something new. They started in 1990 with the schism in Lebanon, and then it has developed in the end of the 90s all over the world. So the first question now is, who are the terrorists in Europe? I would like to focus on global radicalized subjects, that is, those who radicalize in Europe, in the United States. So I'm not referring to the political situation in the Middle East. So my question is the question that has just been raised, that is, why do young people go for death? These young people may be Muslim. However, there's also a high percentage of people who convert from Christianity or from secularized settings and that become part of the ISIS. About 25% of Western volunteers go to do jihad in Syria, and they are converted people, and it is a very high number. Let us then start considering some sociological facts. Who are these young terrorists? I'm going to draw on a database. This database was created on the basis of some terrorists operating in France and Belgium, but what happens elsewhere confirms my analysis. The group that acted in Barcelona coincides with similar features in groups operating in France. The analysis concerns 1995, the first attack that was perpetrated in France by a person who was educated in France, and up to the very most recent attacks. Now I'm going to review some of the common features of these young people, young terrorists. The majority of radicalized people are second-generation young people, that is, they are children of migrant people. That is, these young people received their education totally in Europe. They always use a European language as their native language. The young terrorists who did the attacks in Barcelona speak Catalan. They can't really speak Arabic. So we can say that in the 90s it is normal to find the second generation of young people. However, 22 years later, there is also a third generation in France, in Germany, and also in Great Britain. There's always a second generation, though. 80% basically is second generation. So here we have an anomaly. Why do we always find second generation people? This second generation is overrepresented. And this goes hand in hand with another question. That is, why is there an overt representation of Moroccans and an underrepresentation of Turks? Why are radical people in Germany, Denmark and Holland are more often than not Moroccan than Turk? So we understand that radicalization do not correspond with the demography data. That is, it concerns a very specific group of migrant people. And then there is another point, that is, the majority of these young people do not have a religious education. Even the imam of the city of Ripoll in Spain is a self-proclaimed imam. He spent 2 years in prison due to drug trafficking, so maybe he learned about religion in prison, I don't know, but we cannot really say that prisons are universities of Islamic religion. None of these have had a background as religious militant persons. They were not members of any organization. They have not preached at a religious level. They have never taken part in protests in favor of Palestine. They do not belong to any fundraising group in the Muslim world. So at a social level, they have no origin, basically. There is a kind of lack of social integration in these people. However, this does not mean they do not have a job or that they are illiterate or poor people. Many of them have a job. So it is not really a question of economic exclusion. That's not the problem. Then there's a third point I would like to make. In France, as much as in many other countries, 50% of these have a background of minor crime. For example, they may have been imprisoned due to drug trafficking or for fights, and so on and so forth. So these are people who are already in a setting where they have defied society and they have behaved against the rules. Then, number 4, they are all immersed in the Western young culture in terms of music, their clothes. None of them represent an African or traditional Middle Eastern culture. And the 5th point, which is a little bit weird, since 1997, all the terrorist cells that have acted in France consisted of couples of siblings. In Barcelona, we have these 3 couples of brothers. And this phenomenon is also present in the United States with the Chechenian brothers who did the attacks in Boston. In no extremist or criminal organization is it possible to find these couples of brothers. In the mafia, there is this kind of phenomenon, but in the mafia, there's also the father, the uncle, it's the whole family business, but not among these categories of youngsters. And then, number 6, which is equally important, there is a generational gap. We are talking about orphans. It might be the case that fathers abandon their families, but even when they are in touch with their parents, basically they reprimand their parents because they consider them to be bad Muslims and they refuse the Islam of their parents. When they are in touch with their parents and they have close relations, especially with their mothers, the message that they give their mothers before dying, as was the case in the Brussels attack, their testament was sent to their mothers and they said, "Mother, you are a bad Muslim, but thanks to my sacrifice, you will be allowed to go to paradise, to heaven." And this phenomenon is really relevant to the subject of today's session. There is a sort of generational mismatch. They become the saviors of their own parents, but this means that they received nothing from their parents. And then there is an even more stranger phenomenon, that is all the jihadist volunteers, for example, those going to Syria, have children and then they die, and they know about it. The organization asks them to have children, and they know that they will go to Syria and that they will have to carry out a suicide attack. So they know that they won't be able to educate their children. So you understand, they deny the heritage of the past, and they also deny of leaving a heritage for their children. So that's what I call nihilism. Basically, they annihilate history, they annihilate society. And this goes hand in hand with the hatred that they feel towards the past and the culture. They are iconoclasts. We have seen that in Syria they destroy not only churches and temples from Roman times, but even historical mosques or Muslim cemeteries. Basically, they cancel, they erase history. And now I will move to another point that may summarize everything. That is, they refuse culture, any kind of culture, including the Muslim culture. and they refuse it in the name of a pure religion that has no historical, social, or cultural basis. And this is linked to the essence of their action, that is, everybody dies. Since 1997, 2000, about 2000, almost all terrorists in the West kill themselves or let the others to kill them, for example, the police. There is never a B plan just to escape. There is an incredible video about the latest attacks. This video was shot in Catalonia, in Spain, and it is possible to see these young men in a car without weapons, without bombs. They just have knives. They try to kill some people with their car, and when the police arrives, instead of running away, they stand in front of the police, they defy the police, they pretend to have explosives with them, explosive belts, but these are empty. But the police, of course, shoot them and they die. So we see that death is at the core of their project. The appeal of ISIS is not so much of a political nature, for example, the caliphate, and it's not even of a religious nature, such as in Sharia, because Sharia forbids suicide. This appeal lies in the fascination of an image of ISIS that is based on an aesthetic of violence. It is a fascination of death. ISIS is really powerful in exploiting the cultural codes of modern young culture, for example, music, video games, reference to movies such as Born to Kill or No Future, the theme of the solitary hero killing everybody just like in a video game. From a religious point of view, they think they are going to heaven, so they feel they are religious themselves. However, the fascination they feel is a fascination towards apocalypse. The end of time is close, so it's not worth trying living in this society. They are nihilist and individualistic at the same time. Just before apocalypse, they have to take part in it so that they can assure that they will be saved. And now I'll move on to another point about what all this can tell us about contemporary society. Islamist violence seems to be so strong now in the world, but this is not due to the number of people killed, because the Rwanda genocide was much worse. And there are other contexts in which there are even worse conflicts due to religious persecution. But what we are really afraid of in Islamist terrorism is not violence in itself per se, but it is this fascination for death that is perceived by those who are perpetrating the attacks and killing themselves in this way. These people love death. That is why I think there is a close connection between nihilism and de-acculturation of religion. That is, there is a gap between religion and culture here. which is here really at an extreme level. But this is a contemporary phenomenon, and I believe that understanding this phenomenon is crucial. Since the 60s, the values of the dominant culture are not religious or secularized values. We may say that lay people of the 20th century used to share the same values of Christian people. Abortion was illegal in many countries. Also, homosexuality was illegal in many European countries. And in a country such as France, there was a strong conflict between the Republican state and the church. And it was a political conflict for power and for controlling society, but it was not a conflict on values. Catholic people and lay people used to know each other very well. All the people against the church in France in the 20th century used to know catechism, they knew what it talked about. They were not just against religion. They were simply following another path of spirituality, but they were also against the church. Since the 60s, in general, we can say that there has been a growing gap between the values of the dominant culture and religion. And such a gap can be found in the encyclical Humane Vitae. It is in this text that this gap has been addressed for the first time, because it really questioned the role of values and not the role of the church in the society. Since then, this gap has become sharper and sharper, not just because there's lower numbers of believers. For example, consider the United States. I believe 59% of American people stay to be a believer and to practice their religion, and yet homosexual same-sex marriages have been approved with no problem with the support of public opinion. So the dominant culture is a secularized culture, and this fact is not directly related to the percentage of believers in the society. There are many Muslim Egyptian religious people that can tell us that contemporary religious culture is being secularized and they don't like it, but that's the way it is. The consequence is what I have termed the holy ignorance. That is, secular people do not understand religion anymore, and believers think that the dominant religion is hostile. This phenomenon of the holy ignorance, that is, lay people or secularized people are not against religion, anti-clerical. They do not understand how one can be a believer. And on the other hand, religious groups and the communities of faith tend to consider that the dominant culture is pagan, not just secular, but also pagan, and that it is a threat. And then there is a gray area between believers and non-believers. what disappears is this gray area. The consequence is that in some countries that are very secularized, such as France, there is a solution that seems to be evident to end religious radicalism, and this solution would be to expel the religious person from the public space. In general, the dominant idea in a country such as France today is that a moderate believer should be somebody who believes in a moderate way. For example, police investigations on Islamic radicalism let's say that an investigation is carried out on the religious practice of a believer, which is also, this is also an old practice in the France tradition. In 1904, an investigation was launched on the religious practices of the most important managers in the public sphere. But going back to present time, there's people who go to Mass just for important occasions. And what used to happen in the past, in these investigations that were made, we could read in the documents that if people would go to the Mass every day, then they could not have promotions in their job, in their careers. But today, in the records of the police, for example, in Paris airport, we can read for a Muslim person, if a person drinks alcohol, and if a person drinks alcohol, it is positive. That's okay. Or if he or she goes to the mosque just a couple of times a year, so that's okay. But if this person goes to the mosque a couple of days a week, then it is just already a problem. And if this person prays 5 times a day, they can't be let in the country. They won't be admitted. So there is a sort of double form of violence, a twofold violence. There is the explicit will in French lay peoples and explicit in contemporary secularism to deny and to eliminate religious people from the public sphere, just relegating him or her in the private sphere. On the other hand, there is also believers, and especially the new believers, or as they are called, born-again believers and also converted people. We can find this will of regaining the lost world or just to abandon it at all costs. And now my last observation. What can be done? Here I believe that politics should be managed by the state. It is normal that the state is in charge of citizens' safety and security, and that information is provided by the state as much as security measures are taken, even if they are not so convenient, we don't like them. And all these activities should be managed by the state. However, for civil society, there is another question. In order to fight against this nihilism, we should try and act in the spiritual and religious sphere. The question is preventing religion from being in the hands of radicalized people and trying to offer a space of spirituality within the space of this very secularized society of ours. we should be afraid of what I would call this theological assumption. For example, some people claim that Islam must be reformed. Well, it is absurd, and it's absurd for a number of reasons. Radical people are not people who misinterpreted the scriptures, the Quran. Radical people found what they were looking for in the Quran. It is not by organizing refreshing courses of Islam to the radical people that they can turn into moderate people. When the Red Brigades used to be present in Italy, it was not by means of modern political economy training courses that they could have been converted, but the radical people want radicalism. And then it is not the task of the state, whether it is a Muslim or lay state, to reform a religion. Lay states think that a reformed Islam should be liberal by definition, or in favor of women and gay people by definition. In a democratic society, one has to accept the existence of people who believe in more conservative values. Talking about European values means nothing. What are we talking about? So maybe we're talking about values from the 60s. So should we support homosexuality, or are we talking about religious values? So it's not the state that is in charge of deciding upon the values. In Muslim countries, then, in the majority of cases, the states are authoritarian states, so they won't develop an open Islam based on the dialogue. Muslim states want an authoritarian and conservative kind of state. So it is not up to the foreign states to deal with the education of Muslim people. This should be clear. And to conclude, and this is the most important point, theology is not at the center of religion. There are distinguished experts in theology among us, but believers are not theologians. Theology doesn't lead people to religiosity. Christian theology came after Christ, and for Protestants, Luther was not the cause but a consequence. What really counts is the religiosity of the believer, and it is the way in which they live, they experience their faith in contact with the others, and in which they receive their faith, they experiment with it, they enrich it, and they transmit it, or on the contrary, they impoverish it and they lose it. To stop radicalism, it is then necessary to open, or rather reopen, a space of spirituality, both for common believers and for young people who are searching for the absolute. And here, European believers have played a role in the integration of Islam in Europe, and they have to play this role. I'm not talking about interfaith dialogue here, and I'm not talking about intercultural dialogue either. It is not about discussing the nature of Christ or the relations with Abraham. It is not about discussing European and Eastern culture. Christianity is a universal religion. It is not European culture. Especially now, even Islam is a universal religion that then was adjusted to different culture. So, field work is needed among the civil society to create common spaces of spiritual exchange. But here now, this would go beyond the area of interest that I follow. I'm going to give you 3 examples.
The first concerns a parish priest in Austria. Well, once he realized that the people of his parish had become a parish of Turks. So, well, gradually, half of the people living there were Turks, and so a few mosques opened up. So, what did he do? First of all, he learned Turkish, and with the authorization of his bishop, he goes to study at the University of Theology in Ankara. So, because he wanted to know what the Imam thinks, he wanted to understand what is inside the head of the Imam. When he comes back to Austria, he has a proposal for the foreign ministry that manages relationships with Turkey and for the cardinal. These imams who come from Turkey, they do not speak German, they do not know much about the West, they only speak with the Turks. So this is total closure. So what I propose, on a voluntary and basis and free of charge for all the imams that are interested, stay in a Catholic monastery in the mountains of Austria. No courses, no lessons, no exchanges. But the Imam needs to realize that there are Christians in Europe, because for many Muslims living in the banlieues of Paris, there are no Christians. There are French people, there are populists, there is National Front, there are former communists. Where are the Christians? They don't see the Christians. So that the Imam can understand that there is a very rich spirituality in Christianity. This program met with great success. It is quite easy because you work on a small scale. Then there is a second idea. We need to open up Islam theological faculties in universities together with Christian theological universities, because we wanted to share the same need for a critical standpoint, the same need for a relationship with philosophy, with a contemporary ethical dialogue, in order to recreate this cultural bridge and to work on shared values. So here we realize that there are many initiatives underway, particularly in the northern countries, in Germany, in the Netherlands. And I believe we have to do this independently from the states. Has to be something that comes from the people and not a program of the Ministry of the Interiors. And finally, we always say that there is no European Islam. This is not true. There is a European Islam. It is in Sarajevo, in Bosnia. In 1908, part of the Muslims left Bosnia because they had to play, they would have had to swear allegiance to Emperor Joseph. And so they left. And, fatwa was asked at the university. The idea was, if you're free to profess your religion, you need to pledge your allegiance to the king or emperor of that certain place. So, well, in return, the Emperor Joseph made a lot of things in favor of the Muslims and of the Islam religion, and he said, now you can train and educate here your imams, not in Turkey. The university founded by the emperor is still there. On the right there is now a mosque with a Saudi mosque and a minaret, and on the other side there is a Turkish minaret and a mosque. So this is our choice. With whom do we have to work? Who do we have to meet? The people are there, but we need to see them. Thank you for your attention.
Credo che questo applauso
I think this big round of applause actually expresses the gratitude towards someone who could tackle such a decisive theme for our future using clear words that are not born out of an ideology, but rather from personal experience, observation, and openness, readiness to learn. So this clarity prepares a great work for us to do. For what I've been seeing in these days here at the meeting, the big events, the casual meetings, well, I've seen each of you experiencing the exhibitions, going back to see them again, going to buy the books here at the bookstore. So there is a desire to learn, and that means that there is a desire to change, which is not born out of an ideological project, but rather from the knowledge that life deserves to be lived, and the life of everyone is something big. Listening to the conclusions of Professor Roy, I was thinking about what Monsignor Pizzaballa said at the end of his speech. We do not have to rebuild walls that separate, to create a gap between us and the world. To respond to the ideological radicalism or to ignorance, but by radicalizing ourselves, by reducing the Christian experience to a dialogue that is clear-cut, as Caron would say. This is the time, said Monsignor Pizzaballa, to see the reality of the world as something that calls upon us. Today we do this, and in the past our fathers did this. Something that calls upon our faith. There is nothing in human experience that cannot be enlightened by the experience of the gospel. And this is exactly our task, our duty. then something new will happen. It is to say, what we have earned through this process of rooting the gospel into history will no longer be ours only, mine, yours, but it will become something that is that belongs to everyone. It will be the gift and the heritage of every single person. As Julian said in an article on the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera, after the attacks of Bataclan and Charlie Hebdo, these desperate people, what kind of Christianity do they meet? A deculturized Christianity, closed and enshrined in a fortress, or a human diversity? This is a question that we have heard thousands and thousands of times in these days. Who are you? Why are you the way you are? Come and see, because if we say this with humility and realism, is a small example, not a closed space, but a place where processes are started through meetings, encounters. We see how we can be ourselves. We can be more Christian, more Muslim, or, if a non-believer, a better man. So there is a certain homogeneity between the conclusion of Professor Roy and the message of Cardinal Parolin on behalf of Pope Francis. Cardinal Parolin will be here with us tomorrow for the conclusion of the meeting. So we invite you all to be there to look better in order to see all the signs of God's need as the ultimate sense of existence. So you have to look better instead of turning your head, so that you can offer people a real answer to the big questions of the human heart. So we need to realize that there is a gift, the gift of the experience of the meeting. It's not compulsory, it's not written anywhere, there is no law, but every year the meeting is here. And it's not something that is taken for granted. The responsibility that each of us take upon ourselves, this desire to meet people, to change, can, in a very free way, contribute to the material needs of the meeting. So this is not a final piece of information, something you have heard already many times. It's actually an integral part of this session, of what we're saying today. Donate what you can, but participate in the fundraising operation. The 15 desks with the writing Dona Ora, where you will find the staff wearing the green T-shirt. The green is the color of hope. Thank you, Professor Grimm. Thank you, Professor Ra. Good night, everyone.